I want you to imagine an economic disaster so quiet that politicians could pretend it wasn't happening, so gradual that media ignored it, and so effective that it changed the balance of power across an entire continent. That's exactly what occurred when millions of Canadians stopped visiting America. I've been studying political and economic relationships for decades, and I can tell you that the most devastating weapons are often the ones you never see coming. Not missiles or tariffs, but the simple decision by ordinary people to take their money elsewhere. When Canadians began treating America as a place to avoid rather than visit, they deployed an economic weapon more powerful than any trade war Washington could devise. The official story, to the extent that anyone bothered to tell it, was that tourism fluctuations were normal market adjustments. Seasonal variations, exchange rate impacts, the usual factors that analysts cite when they want to avoid uncomfortable political realities. But what actually happened was far more systematic and far more devastating than any natural market cycle. Canadian families didn't wake up one morning and collectively decide to boycott American tourism through some coordinated campaign. They made individual decisions, family by family, based on a simple calculation that dignity was worth more than convenience. When political rhetoric made them feel unwelcome, when crossing the border began to feel like an exercise in humiliation, when their money was apparently wanted but their presence was not, they chose the most rational response available. They stayed home. The scale of this shift is difficult for most Americans to grasp because we rarely think about how dependent our border economies are on Canadian visitors. But if you live in states like New York, Michigan, Washington, or Montana, Canadian tourism isn't a nice bonus. It's structural. It's embedded in business models, employment projections, and municipal budgets. When that foundation suddenly shifts, the effects cascade through entire regional economies. Let me walk you through what this looked like in practice, because the human dimension of this story is what makes it so compelling and so tragic. Canadian families had been making regular trips to American shopping centers, vacation destinations, and border communities for generations. These weren't occasional luxury purchases, but routine parts of life. Weekend shopping trips, summer vacations, visits to family and friends who lived on the American side of what was supposed to be the world's longest undefended border. When political rhetoric began treating Canada as adversarial rather than allied, when Canadian contributions to American prosperity were dismissed or ignored, when the relationship was framed in terms of dominance rather than cooperation, Canadians didn't respond with angry protests or diplomatic retaliation. They responded with their wallets, and their wallets spoke much louder than any official complaint ever could have. The immediate effects were visible to anyone who cared to look. Parking lots that used to be full of cars with Ontario license plates on weekends began standing half empty. Hotels that had built their business models around predictable flows of Canadian visitors found themselves scrambling to fill rooms. Restaurants, retail stores, gas stations, all the businesses that had quietly depended on cross-border commerce suddenly discovered how vulnerable they were when that commerce simply evaporated. What makes this story particularly tragic is how avoidable it was. This wasn't the result of irreconcilable economic interests or fundamental policy disagreements. This was the consequence of treating people who had been loyal customers and friendly neighbors as if they were problems to be solved rather than relationships to be maintained. When you insult someone's dignity, you can't expect them to keep spending money in your economy. The psychological dimension of this shift is crucial to understanding why it was so effective and so permanent. When people feel unwelcome, they don't just change their immediate plans, they change their long-term assumptions. A family that used to think of cross-border shopping as normal begins to think of it as risky. Vacation destinations that once felt familiar begin to feel foreign. Business relationships that were built on trust begin to feel transactional and unstable. For American border communities, this represented an existential crisis that most political leaders either ignored or misunderstood. These are places where Canadian visitors weren't just customers. They were part of the social and economic fabric. When that fabric began unraveling, the effects were immediate and brutal. Jobs disappeared, tax revenues declined, businesses closed, and communities that had thrived on cross-border integration suddenly found themselves isolated and struggling. The retail sector felt it first and hardest. American shopping centers near the border had built entire business models around Canadian consumers seeking better prices, greater selection, or products not readily available north of the border. When those consumers stopped coming, the impact wasn't just reduced sales. It was empty anchor stores, declining property values, and the slow death of commercial districts that had seemed stable for decades. But the effects extended far beyond retail into tourism, hospitality, transportation, and services. Canadian families had been a reliable source of demand for American vacation destinations, theme parks, sporting events, and cultural attractions. When they redirected that demand toward domestic alternatives or international destinations that offered more welcoming experiences, American tourism operators faced a competitive disadvantage they had never anticipated. What's especially revealing about this crisis is how it exposed the gap between political rhetoric and economic reality. While politicians in Washington talked about making America respected again, their actual policies were making America avoided. While they claimed to be defending American interests, they were destroying American livelihoods in the communities most dependent on international goodwill. The human stories emerging from border communities during this period should have been front-page news, but they rarely were. Small business owners who had built relationships with Canadian customers over decades suddenly found themselves explaining to their children why the family business was failing. Workers in tourism-dependent industries found themselves competing for fewer jobs as demand contracted. Local governments discovered that their tax bases were far more fragile than they had realized. From Canada's perspective, this wasn't retaliation, it was adaptation. When the relationship with America became more costly and less pleasant, Canadians simply adjusted their behavior to minimize exposure to those costs. They found alternative destinations for their vacation dollars, alternative sources for goods and services, alternative places to invest their time and money. This is what rational economic actors do when the terms of engagement become unfavorable. The tragedy here is that this adjustment came at the expense of relationships that had taken generations to build. Canadian families who had been visiting the same American destinations, shopping at the same stores, staying at the same hotels for decades, suddenly began to think of those connections as optional rather than essential. Once that psychological shift occurs, rebuilding trust and familiarity becomes exponentially more difficult. What American policymakers fundamentally misunderstood was that in integrated economies, respect is a form of infrastructure. It's not just a nice sentiment, it's an economic necessity. When people feel respected and welcome, they invest. They visit. They build relationships that generate long-term prosperity. When they feel disrespected and unwelcome, they withdraw. And withdrawal, in an economy built on voluntary exchange, is devastating. The border communities that suffered through this crisis offer a preview of what happens when political posturing collides with economic reality. These are places where abstract policy decisions translate directly into empty storefronts, lost jobs, and declining property values. The people who live and work in these communities didn't choose the confrontation, but they paid its costs. Canadian tourists who used to cross the border regularly began describing a different experience than they had known for most of their lives. Border crossings that used to feel routine began to feel interrogational. Interactions that used to be friendly became formal and suspicious. The psychological border between the two countries began to harden even when the physical border remained technically open. This psychological border proved far more effective than any physical barrier could have been. You don't need walls or checkpoints when people simply choose not to cross. You don't need complex enforcement mechanisms when families decide that staying home is easier than dealing with the stress and uncertainty of international travel that no longer feels welcoming. The most damaging aspect of this entire episode was how unnecessary it was. The economic relationship between Canadian tourists and American border communities was mutually beneficial and naturally sustainable. Canadians got access to American goods, services, and destinations. Americans got economic activity, employment, and tax revenue. Neither side benefited from disrupting this relationship. But disruption occurred anyway, not because of irreconcilable economic interests, but because political leaders chose rhetoric over relationship management. They chose the short-term political benefit of sounding tough over the long-term economic benefit of maintaining trust. And once trust erodes, rebuilding it requires far more effort than maintaining it would have required. For For observers trying to understand how democratic societies maintain prosperity in an interconnected world, this crisis offers important lessons about the relationship between political culture and economic performance. When politics becomes performative rather than substantive, when leaders prioritize appearing strong over being effective, the costs often show up in places and ways that never make the evening news. As I reflect on this episode, what strikes me most is how completely avoidable it was and how long its effects will likely last. Economic relationships that took decades to build were damaged in months. Trust that had been accumulated over generations was squandered for temporary political advantage. Communities that had prospered through cooperation found themselves impoverished by confrontation. The invisible border crisis demonstrates that in modern democratic societies, the most powerful weapons are often the quietest ones. When millions of people simply choose to take their business elsewhere, they're not staging a protest. They're exercising market power. And market power, exercised collectively and persistently, can reshape entire regional economies without a single dramatic gesture or hostile act. This is what happens when political leaders forget that in free societies, cooperation is voluntary, respect is earned, and relationships require maintenance. The border between Canada and America didn't need to be closed to become an economic barrier. It just needed to become a place where people no longer felt welcome. And once that happened, the economic consequences became inevitable, devastating, and largely irreversible.